This is a short video lecture pertaining to food production and the environment. Listed on the screen in front of you is a list of key terms associated with the content in this week's chapter. Make sure you know the difference between food security and food insecurity, green revolution, industrialized high-input agriculture, integrated pest management, organic agriculture, polyculture, and traditional agriculture that's intensive, and traditional agriculture that is considered subsistence agriculture. What is food security and why is it difficult to attain? Food security means having at all times both physical and economic access to sufficient food in order to meet dietary needs for a productive and healthy life. A family is food secure when its members do not live in hunger or fear of hunger. There's definitely enough food in the world. There's enough food to feed everyone, yet 815 million people go hungry. As reflected in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 2, one of the greatest challenges the world will face is how to ensure that a growing global population has enough food to meet their nutritional needs. The good news in this is that 218 million fewer people suffer from undernourishment than they did 25 years ago. Also, 73 out of 129 developing countries have halved the number of people that are considered chronically undernourished. In the countries that failed to meet international hunger targets, natural and human-induced disasters or political instability resulted in increased food insecurity. But the key point is that we are making progress in decreasing food insecurity. So, the World Health Organization, or the WHO, defines three main aspects of food security, and they are food availability, food access, and food utilization. Food availability is having a sufficient supply of food available on a consistent basis. The food can be either locally produced or imported from other places. In some cases, communities may be unable to produce their own food locally because of inappropriate agricultural technologies or practices. Maybe there's a lack of natural resources or productive land. Maybe there's climate constraints or emergency situations like natural disasters or health constraints such as HIV and AIDS that prevent people from engaging in labor. Communities may also be unable to import food from other places because of issues like lack of foreign exchange, political unrest, or lack of transportation. So the food is not necessarily available. Hence, food availability is one category that the WHO is currently investigating on a per-country basis. The second aspect of food security is food access, having sufficient resources to obtain food for a nutritious diet. Even when a sufficient supply of food can exist to feed everyone, food may not always be accessible to everyone. People need to have access to the food, and they need to be able to have sufficient income and resources in order to obtain this food. There are a number of factors that can affect a person's economic access to food, including lack of job opportunities, lack of sufficient income, lack of training or business knowledge for success with income-generating activities. So basically not having enough money to get the food. The final aspect of food security is food utilization, or consuming a nutritious diet. This means that people make appropriate use of food based on the knowledge of basic nutrition and care, and they have access to water and sanitation for preparing food and maintaining proper hygiene. Nutrition education can be an important part of improving food utilization in order to make sure people are aware of the variety of foods their bodies need in order to maintain good health. In many parts of the world, experiencing food insecurity, people may consume sufficient quantities of starchy, staple food like potatoes and rice and maize, but insufficient quantities of proteins like oil, dairy, fruits, and vegetables that balance their diet. Hence, they're living on a very high-carb diet. So, one aspect of food security is food utilization to assure that people are consuming a nutritious diet. On the screen are three terms that I'd like you to be familiar with. The first is chronic malnutrition. This is known as a deficiency of protein and other key nutrients, which weakens people and makes them more vulnerable to disease, and it actually can hinder normal physical and mental development of children. In less developed countries, people suffer from health problems associated with not getting enough to eat. 1 out of every 6 people in less developed countries are not getting enough to eat, and they're facing food insecurity. They live in chronic hunger and poor nutrition, which threatens their ability to lead healthy and productive lives. The second term I'd like you to know is chronic undernutrition or hunger. People who cannot grow or buy enough food to meet their basic energy needs. So the root cause of food insecurity is poverty, and then other obstacles to food security are political upheaval, war, corruption, and even bad weather, including prolonged drought, flooding, and heat waves. An example of food insecurity occurred in 2004 during Western Sudan's Darfur conflict. There were tactics that were used, such as cutting down fruit trees and destroying irrigation ditches. These tactics were used to eradicate the farmers' claim to the land and ruin livelihoods of people living in the area. The UNICEF Fund, or the United Nations Children's Fund, estimate that about 4.7 million people experienced reduced food security because of this conflict and the tactics that were being used. Now, please be sure to note the difference between food loss and food waste. Food loss refers to the decrease in edible food mass throughout the part of the supply chain that specifically leads to edible food for human consumption. So it's something that occurs in the supply chain that results in loss of food. Food waste is food losses that occur at the end of the food supply chain, which are caused by typically retailers, restaurants, and consumers' behaviors. I've already defined the term food security on a previous slide, so let's look at the definition of food insecurity. Food insecurity is the condition under which people face chronic hunger, poor nutrition, and health problems. According to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, or the FAO, in 2010, there were an estimated 925 million chronically undernourished or malnourished people in the world. As population continues to grow to be 9.7 billion people by 2050, it looks like almost half of that population may live in poverty and experience food insecurity. So one of the biggest challenges we have for the future is making sure that we have the ability to provide food globally to the populations that need it. And please remember that food security is based on food availability, food access, and food utilization. In 1997, the United Nations, the World Bank, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, met to formulate a set of goals for international development that would reduce extreme poverty and its impacts on the human well-being. These goals were adopted as a global compact by all United Nations members at the United Nations Millennial Summit in 2000. There were 8 Millennium Development Goals with 17 targets identified. On the screen in front of you are those 8 goals with the different targets that were identified. Please note that the Millennium Development Goals are not focused on economic development, but rather focused on extreme poverty and reducing extreme poverty. For this chapter, we are going to focus on goal number 1, eradicating extreme poverty and hunger. The first 2 targets were to reduce by half the proportion of people whose income is less than $1, now $1.25 a day, by 2014. This goal has actually been met around the world globally. Target number 2 was to reduce by half the proportion of people who suffer from hunger. This goal has not been achieved, but it has declined from 24% to 14% in terms of people living in a status of hunger. Goal number 2 is to achieve universal primary education for boys and girls alike. And that goal was not achieved, but we're at a 90% success rate on this since the year 2000. Goal number 3 was to promote gender equality and empower women. Goal 4 was to reduce child mortality. Goal 5 is to improve maternal health. Goal 6 is to combat HIV and AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. Goal 7, to ensure environmental sustainability. And Goal 8, to forge a global partnership for development. And there's multiple targets within that goal itself. The Millennium Development Goals Report of 2015 summarized the progress towards these MDGs that are listed on your screen. Some goals are almost achieved. Access to safe water, lowering extreme poverty, increasing education, especially for girls, decreased deaths from measles, increasing vaccinations, more prenatal care, fewer maternal deaths. Now, some MDGs were met at the expense of the environment, and there is some greater effort that's needed to meet some of these other goals, such as nourishment of children, lowering maternal mortality, and increasing access to sanitation. With all the goals that are listed here, Goal 7, which states ensure environmental sustainability, is the one that the targets are actually worsening. So we are seeing that we're having issues with declining freshwater resources, declining forests, declining fish stocks, increased biological extinctions, more species becoming endangered or threatened, and increasing greenhouse gases being collected in our atmosphere. So Goal 7 is one that we're not achieving yet, but that's for a different lecture down the road. For the purpose of this chapter, we're focusing on goal number 1, eradicating extreme poverty and hunger. So the 8 Millennium Development Goals established was really a pledge to uphold the principles of human dignity, equality, and equity, and to free the world from extreme poverty. So looking at Millennium Development Goal number 1, the first target was to decrease the number of people suffering from hunger between 1990 and 2015 by half. Well, more than 200 million people are no longer hungry since 1990. We have tracked a decrease from 23.3% of undernourished people to 12.9% in 2015. So we definitely have cut it in half. The second target under Millennium Development Goal number 1 was decrease the people living in extreme poverty between 1990 and 2015 by half. This goal was attained. We went from 1.9 billion people in 1990 living in extreme poverty to a decreased value of 836 million people in 2015 living in extreme poverty. So greater than 1 billion people were lifted out of extreme poverty since 1990.